Good morning. I'm Fran Stevens, the Director of Pre-Award Services at the University of Oklahoma. And today we're going to talk about some basic information that PIs need to know as they're getting ready to start working on doing proposal submissions. So we're going to look at 6 different areas: funding sources, the types of proposals, decision terminology, restricted submissions, understanding deadlines, and formatting. So funding sources, I'm not so much looking at where you can go for opportunities to look for funding, but just in general, some different types of sources so that you can think about if there are areas that you haven't looked at before. So internally, within the university, there are funds at your department and college level, and also the VPRP. And periodically, you'll see announcements for internal competitions for different types of funding. Sometimes they're on special items of interest that the university has, and sometimes they're because of things that are going on within the world, like the pandemic. We've had a couple of internal specific special funding solicitations that have gone out. You could get funds from the OU Foundation. These would be a gift towards your research area that don't have any strings tied to them, like deliverables. And just because something doesn't have indirect costs associated with it does not make it a gift. You can get funds from a variety of federal agencies. Um, the announcements for those requests for funding come out in what's called funding opportunities, and you can get those through grants.gov, FedBiz, and various sponsor websites. State agencies are also a source of funding. They'll issue RFPs, or you might have contacts within the state agency that give you a heads up that there might be a funding request coming out. They also post some information on their websites if you periodically check on their website to see. And also know that if you're dealing with a state agency, there are usually some type of indirect cost limitation associated with their work. It may be flow through from federal funding that they have, or it might be restricted because we usually give a discounted indirect cost rate to a state agent. So you need to work with ORS on that. There are other local entities that you might end up doing proposals with, like art organizations that are providing funding, or special um, state related agencies that aren't really like a state.org type of organization. Um, these you would find out about through contacts that you have within those organizations and their websites. And very likely they will have some type of IDC restriction or research that needs to be done on their IDC. So you would need to work with ORS on that. Commercial entities, these are your companies. You'll usually find out about opportunities that they have through contacts that you have or develop with that company, their websites. You want to be aware of the fact that if you have any type of relationship with that company, that you might have a conflict of interest that needs to be declared. Many times, work done with commercial entities has some type of proprietary or possibly confidential or intellectual property um, limitations or agreements that need to be signed before they will do much work with you, even preliminary proposal type of information. Um, and there are IDC parameters that you need to be aware of on working with commercial entities too. Non-commercial or nonprofit entities, you can find out about their funding sources through the foundation directory. There's also a website called Candid that has a lot of their information that's not even in the foundation directory. You might have contacts within those nonprofit entities or look at their website periodically. Um, you do have to have clearance to proceed with a nonprofit if you're going to be submitting some type of proposal to them and they haven't done a specific call related to research. Um, Many times when it comes to doing a proposal with a nonprofit entity, ORS has to look at it and decide if we're the correct person to handle that or if it should go through the OU Foundation. The submission paperwork sometime that's required for these entries takes some research. Many times they want to know information like uh, when our organization was chartered and who is on the board of directors and what is the funding amount that you have for the entire organization for last year or for a certain number of years. So be sure and look closely at the information that's being requested from you for a submission. There's also fellowships or internships. Information comes out from on those in a variety of manners. You might see regular funding opportunity announcements or listing in grants.gov. There's information posted on various websites, so you would need to look at the sponsor that you normally deal with and see if they've got fellowship type of information being posted. You might have a contact within an organization that gives you a heads up about something. Be aware of the fact that if you're doing a fellowship, you might want to take advantage of the provost policy on significant fellowships where your fringe benefits might be covered. Um, Many times, fellowships give you an option of either accepting the payments entirely on your own or possibly routing them through the university. We would encourage you to always go through the university to reduce your tax implications and to also make sure that you can take advantage of, of the variety of OU resources if something came up that you needed help with, such as legal. One of the reasons why I wanted to go over these different funding sources is to encourage you to diversify your funding portfolio. So don't put all of your eggs in one basket. Many times, like federal sponsors, um, will have budget limitations imposed because of funding cycles as they're going through Congress being not approved or being changed in midstream in the funding. So if all of your funding is from that one source, you could end up in a situation where your research may have a gap in funding. Whereas if you've got funding that's coming in from different federal sponsors or federal sponsors and non-federal sponsors, it just gives you a healthier balance to being able to support your research. Make sure that you learn about your sponsors and try and build relationships with them because sometimes that can help you get a heads up notice that a call is going to come out in a month or two so that you get a chance to start working on your proposal before the actual solicitation is issued. You should also consider different research teams that you're working with as you're doing your research, and not so much just the standpoint of trying not to work with the same people all the time, but also looking at your diversification of your team. Are you trying to involve minorities? Are you developing relationships with uh, primarily Hispanic universities or historically Black universities? Um, are there things that you're doing that are encouraging the development of science and research in areas that have a beneficial impact? So now we're going to talk about types of proposals. So letters of intent, statement of interest, notice of intent, anything like this is usually really short. It's usually either 1 or 2 pages or a form entry. Most of the time, it's just used by the sponsor to see how many people are interested in a certain type of submission, and sometimes so that they can get some preliminary conflict of interest information so they can go ahead and start putting review panels together. A lot of the time, these can be submitted by the PI, but some do require SRO, ARO submission. So that would be submission by ORS. Sometimes they're required and sometimes they're requested. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. And sometimes they have hard deadlines. And if you miss that hard deadline and it's required, then that means that you won't be allowed to submit a full proposal or whatever the next step is. I would also note that at OU, all of these types of submissions, LOIs, SOIs, notice of intents, anything similar, do require submission of an information sheet. A preliminary or pre-proposal, concept paper, white paper, one pager, random order of magnitude, um, anything that's kind of like more than a letter or notice of intent, but not quite a full proposal, falls in this range. So these usually require less documents than a regular full proposal submission, but they can be very complicated too. Just depends on what the sponsor's looking for. They may be used by the sponsor to gauge who's interested in submitting to this particular call or to gather conflict of interest information so that they can look at putting together review panels. They can have a wide variety of special instructions, special forms they want you to include, information about who's on your team. It just varies. They may have no budget, a zero or a placeholder budget entry. They may ask for an estimate or a detailed budget. So the budget can run the gamut. Sometimes the submissions are done by the PI. Some require submission by ORS. They usually have a hard deadline if they're being requested. We see a lot of these, way more than we used to years ago, and it seems like we see more and more every year. Don't assume because you did one last year or a few years ago and it was only a couple of pages and one form that that's what it's going to be the next time you do it. We see changes on these every year, and we see more and more that are requiring additional paperwork and sometimes budgets and forms to go with them. I will note that if a estimate is needed on cost share, or if a detailed budget is requested or submitted, then those usually have to route prior to submission, just like a full proposal would, because we want to document that the detailed budget's being provided. And if there's any cost share, even if it's an estimate, that we know that the source for that cost share has been approved and is covered. We are seeing a lot of times if they ask for a detailed budget or an estimate for the cost share, that they usually expect the PI to stay pretty close to that budget estimate. And sometimes they will not allow any change at all based on it. We do consider all of these types of proposals to require information sheets. So basically, anytime you're submitting anything to a sponsor that they're going to make some type of a decision off of, you need to be doing an information sheet on it before you do the submission. A full proposal is a proposal that may or may not have some type of letter intent or preliminary, and it usually has a wide variety of contents. Examples of some of the contents are that it would have a summary or abstract, some type of a project description or research strategy or technical narrative. Usually these are going to range from 6 to 25 or more pages. References or bibliographies on the key personnel, that you have to say something about your team qualifications, who your key personnel are, that you need to provide bio sketches, current and pending, collaborators, or conflict of interest type information, that they usually want one or more files on facilities and equipment. And this is usually addressing what you have on hand that's going to support the work that you're proposing. They'll usually require some type of a budget justification or narrative, or they may also call it a cost proposal. Many times they'll also require other forms like 424 forms or certifications and representations, and they may ask for various letters of support or institutional commitment. Again, at OU, we require submission of an information sheet for all full proposal submissions and the completion of routing to be done prior to submission. Subcontract is a type of proposal on a preliminary proposal that's going in. If you are a subcontract or if you have a subcontract, the sponsor may require a budget estimate of some type. On occasion, they can also ask for a detailed budget. They may ask for letters of commitment or special forms, uh, and they may also have other requirements that they want to be turned in related to the subcontract in a preliminary proposal. So don't assume just because it's a preliminary that you're not going to need a lot of detailed information from your subcontract. If at OU you have subcontracts and you're doing a preliminary submission, we require that we have an email or a letter acknowledging the participation from your subcontracts ORS equivalent office. This way we know that they are aware that they are being involved in a preliminary submission, and if a budget number is being put forth for them, that they know what that number is. At full submission on a subcontract type of proposal, a statement of work, a budget, a detailed budget, a budget justification, and an official letter of intent or a subrecipient form is needed. And this has to be signed by a person who has authority to commit the organization for the work that's being proposed. There might be other items that might be needed, like special forms, biosketches, current and pending. Um, if you are the person who's putting the submission in and you have subcontracts, you're also probably going to want information from them on what facilities and equipment they have that they might be using to help support the work that's being proposed. Just like the other types of submissions, if you are a subcontract, let's say to a company, and you're going to do a submission with that company, that requires an info sheet and for you to do the routing before you submit paperwork or anything to the company for that submission or the organization, whoever the subcontract is with. Another type of proposal is a supplement or a supplementary type of proposal. This is tied to an award. So let's say maybe you've been talking to the program officer and they've agreed to give you an extra $10,000 to modify an objective or to do something else, travel for a conference or something related to this award that you have. So you would do an info sheet for a supplementary type of proposal. Many times they'll have a deadline associated with them. So, for example, the sponsor may say, you can do a supplement, but we need to have it processed 60 days before the end of the project. Some examples of some different types of supplementary proposals are an REU, which is a research experience for undergraduates. That's very common with NSF. Administrative supplements are very common with NIH. This could be to address diversification. Maybe you have come across a really good postdoc or grad student that is from a minority that you would like to give some beneficial exposure to this research that you're doing. There are special diversification supplementary funds that you can obtain. Maybe you had an issue with some equipment that needs some repair or needs to be replaced. You can do an administrative supplement with NIH for that too. There are separate types of equipment and conference and travel proposals that different agencies like Department of Energy, NSF, NASA, all have these that can be tied to awards that you already have. So you might want to be aware of these so you can take advantage of them. Another type of proposal is a revision or an update. This is something that's done after a proposal has already gone in. On a revision, in most cases, when we see those, that is when you're being considered for funding, but the sponsor has come back and has either told you that they want you to cut your requested amount or that they're going to increase your requested amount. And so you've got a proposal processing, but you don't quite have an award yet, and they're coming back asking you to make some changes. So this would be a revision. You may also have a proposal that, say it's NIH and you submitted it last year, and you're going to resubmit the same proposal this year because it wasn't funded, but you want to address comments that the reviewers made. So you may call this a revision. ORS would actually call that a resubmission, and it would be processed really as a new proposal because you're going to be doing a new submission on it. But there will be a couple of items that will annotate on the submission showing that it is a resubmission. Most of the time, a revision or an update type of submission only involves certain components of the original submission needing to be replaced or updated. So you'll only do those specific items that need to be updated or corrected. A renewal is when you already have an award and you have received indications from your sponsor that they want this work to continue. So a renewal is tied to an award. Most of the time they have deadlines associated with them. So many days prior to the end of the project, you've got to turn in your renewal paperwork or you won't be considered for the renewal because they'll have to release the funds for consideration for other projects. A renewal can be competing or non-competing. So if it's non-competing, that means pretty much unless something happens with the sponsor's budget where they don't get the funds they're anticipating, you will receive those funds. If it's competing, then your submission, while marked as a renewal and may get extra consideration for funding, they will also be considering a batch of new proposals that is coming in being considered for funding. So if they find something that they like better than the work that you've been doing on your current award that they want to fund, then they'll fund that instead of funding the renewal. A resubmission, I kind of mentioned before when we talked about revisions, a resubmission is something where you're resubmitting, you've already like submitted it in the past and it wasn't selected for funding, but now you've got some new data or you want to respond to reviewers' comments, some reason where you believe you're going to have a better chance at success if you resubmit that proposal. And we may count it within ORS as a new submission. But don't worry, we'll make sure that if the sponsor actually counts it as a resubmittal, that it is marked that way to the sponsor. Many times in a resubmission, there will be a special area or a way that you are supposed to mark how you have responded to the reviewer's comments. So for example, if you're doing an NIH submission and you're doing a resubmission, they have what's called an introductory section, and that's where you address your response to the reviewer's comments. And you should also know that if you're doing a resubmission, you may have limitations on how many times you can do a resubmission. Most times it's once or twice. Anything more than that, and you have to make a major change in whatever you're doing for that research, including the title. And we have seen a few times when resubmissions were done and the PI didn't change enough of the information and the program officer recognized that the proposal was being resubmitted and it was past the number of times that it could legally be done, and they automatically rejected it. Another type of proposal that we've just recently started seeing a lot of are zero budget proposals. So this is where some cost share has been mentioned in a submission to another organization, and it's been captured, especially at award. If you know that this is happening, then it should be done at submission. Unfortunately, we normally find it when the paperwork comes in for the award or during an audit process. So let me explain this a little bit more if we're not clear. Let's say you were doing a proposal with HSC that was going into OCAST. And in this proposal to HSC, you've been talking with the PI there, and you tell them, oh yeah, I don't mind working on this proposal with you. You can put me down for 5 or 10% of effort, because OCAST wants an effort entry for everyone who's involved on the proposal, even if it's just 1%. Well, anything over 1% has to be reported and tracked internally at OU Norman. So OU Norman has to make sure that they're collecting the information to send to HSC for HSC to provide to OCAST in the reporting that your effort has been expended for this work that you've promised to do. So we would encourage you as much as possible not to quantify time that you're spending on other proposals, because if it is quantified anywhere in the proposal, then it can be listed in the award and has to be tracked. And we should really be documenting it at the proposal submission stage and not waiting for it to be caught at audit or at the award stage. For the most part, most of these we've seen have involved HSC collaborations, but we are aware of the fact that it could and probably is happening with other organizations. Um, so just be aware of the fact it's no biggie if you do want to quantify the cost share, and especially if cost share is required or the sponsor requires for levels of effort to be documented. There is no problem with you doing an info sheet for this and indicating that there isn't budget coming to OU for this, but you are wanting to document the cost share that's being provided. There are many organizations that have special types of proposals. Most of the time, these will deviate from the full proposal instructions, so you want to do some research to find out what might be involved. Many times they are standalone submissions, so they go in on their own right and they don't have to be tied to a regular or a full proposal submission, but sometimes they are. Um, Many times they'll have specific budget or time limits. Sometimes they'll have both. Um, Sometimes they're required, like when you have funding in progress or before the end of an award period, or they won't have any tie at all. Some examples of these are equipment proposals, travel, conference. Um, for NSF, an example would be the rapid proposals. Um, those would be like if there was a tornado, a certain type of special event that you needed to go out and collect data. Um, they would do those usually within a week to 2 weeks of you submitting the proposal. Those only require, I think it's a 6-page project summary. But they have special information for all of these types of special proposals. NIH has the diversity supplements, which I've mentioned before, and administrative supplements. So these special types of proposals, look at the general instructions, because that's usually where the information for these is found, or go on to the sponsor's website and do a search for supplements or special proposals. As you develop relationships with the sponsors that you're going to be doing routine proposal traffic with, you'll start to learn some of the unusual types of proposals that they might have. Something else that I want to mention is a lot of like DoD and NASA organizations do internships for professors to come to their facilities and work with their scientists for periods of time. Sometimes these don't have like a solicitation call put out on them. They'll come out, the information will come out usually through contacts that you have within those organizations, or through information that they post in their listservs or on that specific division's website. And it'll usually give you the requirements for how to apply for that when that posting is made. So when you're getting ready to do a proposal, you need to know the terminology that the program officers or the solicitations might use related to your proposal. So when they say something is requested, that means it's desired. It's not really needed, Usually you can still participate with follow-on actions, like a full proposal submission or whatever the next step is, but it's something that they want or that they desire. I will tell you most of the time, if the program officer needs something, um, it doesn't hurt you to try and provide it, because that helps you develop a good working relationship with that program officer. Um, if they say that something is recommended, that means the same as requested. It's not required, and it shouldn't keep you from participating in follow-on actions. But recommended usually means they have a stronger interest in receiving it than if they had just listed it as requested. So if you see something that is recommended, I would recommend that you really treat that as required, because they are trying to express they're really, really interested, but they don't want to close the door completely if someone hasn't given them that recommended item. If they say that something is required, they are telling you that if you don't provide that item, you will not be allowed to do the follow-on actions or steps. So for example, if a solicitation says that a letter of intent is required by X time or date, and you don't submit one, then usually you look further down in the solicitation and it'll tell you the full proposal submission is only eligible or open for those who submitted whatever that preliminary action was, whether it was a letter of intent, preliminary, or concept paper. So if it's required, that means you must do it. So decisions that can be made on application materials that you put in, invite or not invite, is called a decision final type of decision. So you put in a preliminary, you receive notice back from the program officer that you are invited to submit a full proposal. That means you can go forward with the full proposal submission. If you get an email back that says you are not invited to submit a full proposal submission or whatever the next step is, then that means your process has stopped and you are not allowed to go further. You can go back to the program officer and request reconsideration, but most of the time they aren't going to change their minds, and many times they won't even entertain emails discussing whether or not your not invitation should be changed to an invitation. The other type of decision that you'll usually see is called an advisory decision. And this is like encourage, discourage. So if you receive back an encourage email, then they're not telling you that you're, top candidate for funding or anything like that. They're just telling you that they're okay with you submitting for the next step in this proposal. If you receive an email or a letter back that says you're discouraged from submitting to whatever the next step is, or discouraged from submitting a full proposal, then that means they will accept a submission from you. You won't be blocked. You can go ahead and submit. However, maybe there was either something that they didn't like in your submission, or they felt like it didn't meet the needs of the call that was put out. They'll usually, if you get some type of reviewers comments back, it'll tell you enough information you can figure out kind of why you were discouraged. Most of the time, from what I've seen, program officers, if they give you a discouraged statement back, it's usually a major overhaul or a major amount of information that you need to change or add to your proposal in order for you to be in the running with the other people that they were encouraging to submit. So you really need to think hard about if you want to spend the time to try and bring this proposal that was discouraged up to the point that it can compete with the ones that were already told to advance, or if you should wait for the next call to come out and work on the proposal some more in the meantime. A withdrawal decision means that a proposal that has been submitted has been pulled from further review or further action. And this decision can be made by the PI, by OU, or by the sponsor. Um, some examples of why you might see this happen. A sponsor might come back and either withdraw a proposal or ask for it to be withdrawn because they know that you've already been selected for funding on another award, and they don't want you to have two proposals going at the same time, or to receive two awards at the same time. And so they don't want to expend the resources to do a second review on another proposal for you when they know that there's already funding in process for your first submission. It might be a withdrawal done by OU because we find out that there was an undisclosed conflict of interest that can't be resolved, or maybe you submitted without going through OU and we have found some difficulty that we can't resolve with the after the fact routing or subcontracts that are involved. And so OU initiates the withdrawal action. As a PI, you might decide to withdraw it. Maybe you had several team members that were involved in this proposal, and something's come up, and now they can't participate any longer. And so you don't want the proposal to go through review, knowing that your team has disbanded or had issues come up and can't support you any longer. A solicited, unsolicited. Usually solicited means that it's in response to some type of a call, um, or a specific solicitation that's been put out by a funding organization, while unsolicited means that there's not a specific call that you're responding to. So you're going in open or not tied to specific um, funding that's being announced. Many times an unsolicited proposal is submitted against the general guidelines. In some cases, if a program officer has been contacted, for example, NASA, um, they may tell you, well, while it's not covered under this particular solicitation, go ahead and put it in under this number and let me know when you've submitted it, and then they'll go in and pull it. So most agencies will take unsolicited proposals. However, the funding, unless you've got a really great idea, is usually better under a solicited proposal, because if it's solicited, then that usually means they already have the money set aside for work in a particular area of interest that they have. I will note that NASA does not use this term this way. For NASA, a solicited proposal is one where a program officer has specifically come to a PI and asked them to submit a proposal. Um, and this may be like you haven't sent a white paper or anything to this program officer. The program officer might read of research that you've done with another agency or something that you've published, and it may be applicable to an area that they have interest in. And so they contact you and ask you to do what they call a solicited proposal. The word accepted and approved means different things for different sponsors, but usually it means that something has passed a certain step in processing or that it meets minimum requirements. It usually doesn't mean that it's awarded or funded. And if it is used in relationship to awarded or funded, do not take any action on it, because until an official notice of award has been accepted by the university, you can't begin work or do any expenditures related to what you've been told by an email or something like that related to a proposal that you've put in. A proposal that's rejected usually means either no further action is allowed or desired. Usually this happens either um, because a PI has decided to withdraw a proposal and the system doesn't allow withdrawal, so it has to be marked as rejected, or because something was found out of compliance in what was submitted. So maybe a file that was needed was missed or corrupt, or a form entry had an error in it, something like that. Something that was needed for that proposal wasn't there, so it's not going to be allowed to be reviewed by a review panel for possible award. There are a few times if you get a proposal rejection, depending on where it occurs in the process, that you might be allowed to do a resubmission. A lot depends on timing. If the program officer has already started pulling proposals for a review panel, it's usually very unlikely that they will let you to resubmit a rejected proposal. So some other things that you might hear are notice of award, awarded, funded, just in time, at or below pay line, or selected, and sponsor award announcements. So all of these terms are related to possible award actions that are being considered, but until an official notice comes into ORS and is accepted, then you don't really have an official award action and you can't spend or do work on the proposal unless you set up a prior authorization where if something happens and the award negotiations fall through or the award isn't accepted, then you or your department become liable for the expenses that you've already incurred. Read everything that you get from the sponsor very closely. There are some agencies that'll send out congratulation emails. And so the first line will say congratulations. And then when you start reading down in the paragraph, it'll say something along the lines of, you know, we loved your proposal. It was great. You were selected, but you were below the pay line. So what that means is they really liked your proposal, but they don't have the money for it. So you aren't being funded. One of the primary organizations that will do this is OCAS, just so you know. Sometimes when you get decisions like these in 6 months to a year and a half, if they get more budget, they will come back and they will go back and fund some of those. So we do see that happen once in a while. The other good thing about when you get one of these type of congratulations, you're not being funded deals is that's an indication that you do have a strong proposal. So maybe if that sponsor can't fund it, maybe you can retool that proposal and use it for a submission to a different agency or to a different solicitation. If you receive anything from a sponsor related to an award or a request for information, even if they do a public announcement where they mention that you're going to be receiving funding, make sure that you contact ORS so that we know what you're hearing from the sponsor. Sometimes if they have forgotten to copy ORS on the email, then we can reach back out to them to make sure that we're in the loop and we can find out when we'll be getting the official paperwork. We don't always see all of the announcements that come out in the newspapers and stuff like that. So sometimes when you let us know that this announcement's being made, it could be the first time that we've heard that the award is going to take place, and then we can reach back out to the sponsor to get confirmation and to start getting paperwork from the sponsor. Restricted submissions. So restricted submissions, you'll sometimes hear referred to as limited competitions, but what that means is somewhere in the solicitation, it has some statements that talk about who can submit or how many times someone can submit, either from a PI perspective or from an organizational perspective. Usually, if it's an organizational type of limit, then we will hold some type of an internal competition. Do not assume because you haven't seen a notice of intent for an internal competition that there isn't one needed, because we get hundreds of solicitations that come in every day, and it's impossible to go through and catch all of the ones that might need to have internal competitions announced. And many times the sponsors will have short notice solicitations that have these limitations. So they'll only have a month from the time the solicitation comes out to when the proposals are due. So if you see a limitation in guidelines on how many can be submitted by an organization, either as a primary or the subcontract, you should contact the ORS Limited Submission Office and give them a heads up that you're interested in participating in this proposal, but you believe that there could be a limited competition involved. Um, if we are only allowed as an organization to submit one or two or however many the number is, uh, if that number is exceeded, then usually it results in either all of the submissions from OU being rejected, or the PI can go in and decide which one they like the most, or not the PI, the program officer, or the program officer can come back to ORS and say, we have more than one submission to this call. Who is going to be, or who are your representatives for this particular solicitation? Should we get an email like that back from a program officer, our automatic selection for who gets to go forward is whoever has completed the internal process, even if the internal process was completed after the fact. So if you're at the deadline and you find out that a limited competition is needed, or if you submit it and then you find out that it's needed, as soon as you find out that it was a restricted competition, let us know. Because if it gets flagged later on in processing, going ahead and doing the notice of intent for the limited competition may protect you in being allowed to go forward with that submission for full review or for selection um, with the sponsor. Know that I've mentioned you might have a limited competition because of subcontracts. Sometimes sponsors will say you can have one or two as a primary organization or a lead organization, and it'll say it doesn't matter how many you have if you're a subcontract. Other times it may say participation as a subcontract counts against how many you can have as a lead, or you may have an allowed number of so many as a lead organization and so many as a subcontract organization. So don't just assume because your friend Bob at University XYZ asked you to be a subcontract, and you're not going to bother to do an information sheet or anything, that it's not going to cause problems down the line if it comes to find out that a limited competition was involved and that it kept someone from being able to submit who had gone through the process. So deadlines. So when you're talking about deadlines, you may have special exceptions that are allowed for things like natural disasters, or let's say all the servers shut down at OU for a whole day or something like that, or for personal issues. Let's say you had a death in the family, or for courtesy. There are a few organizations that if you are on a review panel, as a thank you for being on a review panel, they will let you have extra time to do a submission yourself. So if you do have special exceptions to a deadline, they usually always require permission before that deadline is reached to give you that extension. And many times, some type of email or letter from the program officer has to be included with your submission to document that you did have permission for the exception. You'll have no deadline submissions. These have an open or a rolling deadline, which means you can submit them anytime throughout the year. But you have to have close communication with the program officer, because if you don't, you might miss a review panel. A collaborative submission by multiple organizations is normally has to be submitted by the deadline of each organization. Um, and usually, if there are special documents, those are only submitted by whoever is the lead in the collaborative. So what I mean by submission by the deadline is if several, let's say your collaborative involves organizations from um, Vermont, Oklahoma, and Las Vegas. All of you have to have your submission in by whatever the deadline is in your location. So if it's 5 o'clock, close of business on the 15th, and OU doesn't get theirs submitted until 5:05, then that means the whole collaborative proposal, all the parts, even if we were just a non-lead, are killed because one member of the team missed the cutoff of the deadline. Be aware that deadlines can be at any time. So watch for unusual ones. We see a lot of Eastern deadlines because many of the federal agencies are on the East Coast, but once in a while you will see a Mountain or Pacific time. If no time is given, or if the area of the time is not specified, you should ask ORS because we may know based on prior experience when those are normally due, or we can ask the sponsor. For many federal sponsors, if they give a time, it's 5 p.m. local. If it is marked as a deadline, like they'll say the deadline is X date, then that means there is no acceptance after that deadline date. So if you come rolling in a day or two after that deadline date, unless you had permission to submit late, which we just talked about, then you're probably not going to be considered. Very seldom will the program officers allow extra time if you've already gone past the deadline, even if it's just a few minutes, because that gives you an unfair advantage over someone who did meet the deadline. Now, I will note that if you have a deadline that falls on a weekend or a holiday, you might see if the sponsor has a policy, because several of the federal agencies do, on whether it might be due the Friday before the weekend date or if it's extended to the following business day. And most of them, if it's on the weekend, will extend to the next business day. But if they don't say and you can't find that there is a general policy, then do not assume that because it says the proposal is due on Sunday, that they're going to accept it on Monday. A submission window is just a range of time that the program officers want to see a submission done within. This is usually because this is when they're going to be doing some initial checks of the submissions and starting to pull together the review panel. The end date of a submission window is the same as a deadline date. A target date means that that's just it, it's a target. They will accept proposals after that date. But the thing to know on a target date is you're probably going to miss a review panel, or you need to be talking to the program officer about when the review panel is going to be convened. Because if you miss the review panel, then they will just hold your proposal until they put the next panel together. And so you could be waiting 3 to 6 months from that time that you submitted it until they decide to put the next team together. A lot of times, if you're looking at a target date, it's a good thing to consider them actually a deadline date. And I already talked about the collaborative proposals submitting have to be each done by their location. There are some NSF divisions that are going to no deadline submissions, which is like an open window or rolling deadline where you can submit throughout the year. And while you can submit those throughout the year, so you don't have to worry about having a late proposal, I will say that it's also a good idea to go ahead and talk to the program officer and see if they'll give you some information about when they might like to have submissions or when they might be pulling together a review panel. so that you can target for when you're shooting to do your submission close to when it might be considered for funding. For formatting, most organizations, and this doesn't matter whether it's federal or nonprofit or commercial, usually if they're asking for a proposal somewhere, they have guidance on what they want to see um, the proposal look like. If you can't find something, talk to ORS. If you want to go ahead and start working on it, a general rule of thumb is that your margins should be 1 inch all the way around, and you should be using a common font like Times New Roman or Arial or Courier, something like that. And that the proposal needs to be legible. So don't make it real teeny. Don't go below like a 2.5 font size. There are a lot of sponsors now that limit the typefaces and the fonts that can be used. So you want to look at that either in the specific solicitation or the general guidelines. Some even go so far as providing measurements on the formatting because they've had trouble with people going in and changing spacing between characters or kerneling between lines to try and get more information in a proposal than what the normal settings would allow them. And those measurements are no longer done by hand. They have software programs that do those checks now. You want to watch your file names because not only will some systems have errors with extremely long file names or ones that have unusual characters in them, but the solicitation might have specific names that they want used for files. Page numbers may or may not be allowed in your proposal, so you want to look at that. Don't put information in odd areas of the proposal in an attempt to circumvent page limits. So for example, don't put 2 or 3 paragraphs of information that you can't find a place to stick them in your project description by trying to stash them into your references because they do look for things like that. If your proposal is loaded in sections and it's not loaded as all one file, then you should probably start each section with the name of the section at the top of the page of your document so that when it's all merged together, it's easy for the reviewers to find the sections. It's usually best to PDF a file before you load it, but be sure and watch the instructions because there are times that they may say that they want a specific format to be uploaded or that they want the PDF to be done by a certain software program or to have certain settings done on it. Be careful with interactive PDFs. Some systems will allow those to be submitted as interactive and some won't. They want you to take that interactive PDF and do a print to PDF or save it in such a manner that it kills the interactive aspects of that PDF. After you do a PDF, you want to make sure that you check to make sure that when it did the conversion, it didn't creep over into another page or add a blank page because that can throw your page numbers off if you have restricted page counts. We have seen proposals rejected in ORS for PIs using the wrong font or font size. So just be careful and make sure that you follow the instructions for what formatting is needed for the proposal that you're working on. So your takeaway, if you're a PI, try and decide what your sponsors are likely going to be and research them. Look at their websites, look at their review cycle, where and how they post announcements, and start making contacts with the program officer. Learn about the submission system that's used or how what the normal contents of a submission are. Be aware of what general instructions that you may need to follow are and what the timing is when they normally put announcements out. try to generate a timeline for your submission so that you're not scrambling in the last day or two prior to the deadline, trying to throw everything together to be able to meet the deadline. Um, don't forget to do the information sheet early and talk to your proposal development specialist about any submission system or registrations that might be needed. Many times the solicitations will say that you need a grants.gov account or you need SAM registration or things like that. And they're talking about from a applicant perspective, and the applicant is usually considered to be the university. And the university already has accounts set up for all the major submission systems. And if another account is needed with a different submission system, we will set one up so we can do your submission for you. The only time you need individual accounts set up is when you're doing a submission as a fellowship that's going to be paid directly to you, or if it happens to be a system that only allows submissions by the PI, or that they want the PI to have an account so that after submission information can be relayed to the PI, like reviewers' comments. Make sure that you check for any eligibility restrictions, because if there are some and you notify us and participate in the limited competition, then that helps protect you later if more submissions are made than what are allowed. Don't submit items for one sponsor that you developed for another sponsor unless you've gone back in and reformatted it to meet that sponsor's requirements. If I can tell that you're doing an NSF submission using what you just submitted to NIH without knowing that you submitted to NIH, then trust me, the other reviewers at NSF can tell that you didn't take the time to really look at the guidelines that NSF put out and restructure your proposal. You simply slapped a few different terms in there and you're submitting your NIH submission to NSF and vice versa. So that's all that I have for you today. I hope that this had some benefit to you. And if you have any questions, be sure and contact ras@ou.edu, and we'll be happy to research your question and get back with you with an answer. Thank you very much for your time and attention.